My name is John Lorden, and I've been looking into hundreds of unsolved mysteries over the past 5 years on my YouTube channel, Lorden Arts. And I've been known to bring a respectful, victim-focused approach to the stories that I cover while donating thousands of dollars directly to those cases and the charities that help them. Now, I'm bringing that approach and sensibility, along with some of the biggest mysteries I've ever looked into and some new ones, to a weekly podcast called Seriously Mysterious. From bizarre occurrences to unsolved murders and unexplainable disappearances, everything is fair game on this show as long as it's seriously mysterious. You can find Seriously Mysterious on your favorite podcatchers or by visiting seriouslymysterious.com. Let's look into the mysterious together.
Ooh, I've been dying to try this place.
Oh my god, me too. I've heard such good things about it.
Welcome to the Crime Diner. I'm Cindy. I'll be cooking for you this evening. Here are your menus.
Oh, what are you thinking about getting?
I don't know, murder with a side of cannibalism? What about you?
Ooh, that sounds good. I'm torn between historical mayhem and the social injustice, maybe?
Oh.
I just want to let you know that each episode comes with dinner, dessert, and a specialty drink chosen by yours truly.
Wine Dine and Storytime has had a makeover, and we invite you to slide into the booth with us at the Crime Diner, where each week we will discuss a crime over dinner, drinks, and dessert. See you there!
I'm Edward October, creator-host of Octoberpod, and we're both listening to Calls of Death on the Darkcast network.
Hello, and welcome to Cause of Death, 100 Seconds to Midnight. I'm your host, Jackie Moranti. This will be the last episode in the Moldy Oldies season. Next, we'll be looking at restaurant rogues, or foodborne diseases. I've started putting Patreon-only content up once a month. September's episode was on genetics and the double Merle gene trait in dogs. It's called My Dog's Silent World. You can hear this content by signing up for my Patreon at www.patreon.com/Jackie Moranti. If you sign up at the $5 level, you'll not only get ad-free content, but you'll get this bonus content. Those who sign up at higher levels also get other perks like scripts, merch, and some other stuff. October's episode will be a Halloween episode on scurvy, complete with pirate voices. We'll see if I can actually pull that off. There will also be a 100 Seconds to Midnight Halloween episode dropping on the normal feed. That one is a surprise, so you're just going to have to wait and see what it is. And I'm doing a collaboration with the Darkcast network, where the entire network will be telling creepy Halloween stories. I'll drop that one on my normal feed as well. So now all you Halloween fans can get creeped out in several ways. You'll notice that I'm not doing deep dives into the etiology and pathology of the diseases that I've been talking about recently. Mostly because I listened to some past episodes and I thought it was just a lot for everyone to digest. I do put that information in the links in the show notes if anyone is interested. The plague has some really interesting immune responses, and the evolution of the disease is really fascinating. Now, if there are people out there who want me to start including information like that in the episodes, please reach out. I love that part of these diseases, and I think it's rather important to know. I just didn't want to bore everyone out of their skulls with an overload of information when all you wanted to hear was the stories. And with that, we'll get on with it. Today, we're talking about the Black Death, the history of the plague. I have to say that this has been my favorite season so far. These historical diseases are not only interesting, but they give us a deeper look into mankind itself. You'll see how when we get to the history part of this episode. But first, we'll begin with etiology and pathology. Plague is an infectious disease caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis. It is a gram-negative coccobacillus in the family Entobacteriaceae, and it's an obligate pathogen. Y. pestis has gone through several evolutionary changes over the centuries that have allowed it to undermine the immune system and become more virulent. Genetic DNA shows that it evolved from its enteric pathogenic relative, Yersinia pseudotuberculosis, about 6,000 years ago. The determinants of virulence include the Yersinia outer protein, or YOPS, the broad-range protease, or PLA, the pathogen-associated molecular patterns, or PAMPs, and the iron capture systems. The changes in these genes have allowed the pathogen to replicate with no restrictions in the lymph nodes and in the lungs. Some of these proteins, as well as capsular antigen F1, are exploited for the bacterium's diagnostic purposes, causing rapid onset of death in untreated patients. These changes occurred through gene gain and reduction over time. I'm not going to go any further with that, but check out the show notes if you're interested. The evolution of this disease is super fascinating. This evolution is causing the outbreaks we see today, and it's the reason that Yersinia pestis has been added to the list of possible biological weapons. Plague is a vector-borne disease that is transmitted by fleas to rodent reservoirs. These reservoirs include rats, mice, squirrels. Claire, stay away from the squirrels. Rabbits, prairie dogs, chipmunks, and voles. Dogs and cats who come in contact with any infected wildlife can also become infected and carry the fleas to their owners. The bacteria can also enter the body through contact with animal blood through open wounds or breaks in the skin. New theories on transmission include body lice and infected grain. There are 3 varieties of the plague. Bubonic plague is the most common. This variety is named after the swollen lymph nodes that develop in the first week after a patient becomes infected. These buboes can be situated in the groin, armpit, or neck. They get to be about the size of a chicken egg and are tender and firm to the touch. Other symptoms include sudden onset of fever and chills, headache, fatigue, and muscle aches. Septicemic plague occurs when bacteria multiply in the patient's bloodstream. The symptoms for this variety are fever and chills, extreme weakness, abdominal pain, diarrhea and vomiting, bleeding from the nose, mouth, rectum, or under the skin, shock, and gangrene in the patient's extremities, most commonly the fingers, toes, and nose. In case you're not sure what gangrene is, it's when the skin turns black. Hence, historically, the disease was called the Black Death. I'll talk a bit more about gangrene in a future episode. The third variety is pneumonic plague. This variety affects the lungs. This is the least common but most dangerous variety. It can be spread from person to person through the respiratory route. Symptoms can present a few hours after infection and include cough with bloody sputum, difficulty breathing, nausea, vomiting, high fever, headache, weakness, and chest pain. Pneumonic plague progresses rapidly. Respiratory failure and shock occur within 2 days of infection. If a patient does not begin treatment within 24 hours of becoming symptomatic, death is likely to occur. The risk of getting plague is very low. There are only about 5,000 cases reported worldwide every year. Plague outbreaks are most common in rural and semi-rural areas with high population density that have poor sanitation and have lots and lots of rodents running around. Human infection is most common in Africa, especially Madagascar. It's also common in Asia and South America. Although rare, the U.S. reports a few cases of plague each year. These cases are primarily centered in New Mexico, Arizona, California, and Colorado. Veterinarians have a higher risk of contracting the plague through treatment of household pets that have been infected. Any occupation that involves working outdoors where rodent populations are high are also at risk of becoming infected. People who hike, hunt, or camp in areas where plague-infected animals live can also become infected. There is no vaccine publicly available for the plague, but it is easily treatable with antibiotics if the patient is treated quickly. Antibiotic treatment can also be used as a prophylactic if someone is at risk of becoming infected or has had a previous infection. Other precautions include rodent-proofing your home by removing all potential nesting areas. Don't leave pet food outside, and if you become aware of a rodent infestation, take steps to control that. Keep your pets flea-free. Wear gloves when handling any animals that could be infected. Use insect repellent. Keep pets and kids away from any animal that could potentially be infected. Management of outbreaks is also important. This can be done by finding the source of infection and stopping it. Protecting healthcare workers through proper PPE. Healthcare professionals need to ensure that their patients are being treated properly. Quarantine of patients with pneumonic plague. Identifying and monitoring those who have come in contact with pneumonic plague patients. Disinfection of areas where infected animals or people live. Proper hand washing, and safe burial practices. This all sounds very grim, and I'm hoping that it teaches you not to pet the wildlife. But on the flip side, plague is very survivable in patients who receive treatment quickly. Time is of the essence, though. In untreated cases, the mortality rate is between 70 and 100%. A vaccine does exist, but it's mostly ineffective. And in the U.S., it's only given to those who are at a higher risk of contracting the disease. Let's get on to the history. In both the Old and New Testaments of the Bible, plagues refer to divine justice and punishment. Probably the best known are the 10 plagues of Egypt described in the book of Exodus. Pestilence was the most serious of these plagues. It was used in retaliation against the Philistines who captured the Ark of the Covenant from the Jews. The Ark of the Covenant was a sacred chest that contained the tablets of Mosaic law, also known as the Ten Commandments. The Ark was a sign to the people of Israel that God was with them. The Ark of the Covenant was kept in the most sacred part of the temple in Jerusalem. In Leviticus chapter 16, verse 2, Yahweh said that, quote, He would dwell in a cloud between the wings of the cherubim above the mercy seat, end quote. In Numbers chapter 7, verse 89, it says that, quote, His voice would be heard from between their wings, end quote. The Philistines defeated the Israelites, killing 30,000 men. They captured the ark and took it to the city of Ashdod. They put it in the temple of Dagon, directly in front of his statue. The following morning, the priests found the statue of Dagon lying face down in front of the ark. They set the idol up and left, only to return sometime later to find that the statue had been knocked over again, and this time his head and arms were cut off. A short time later, a plague of tumors overtook Ashdod and other Palestinian cities. The Palestinians returned the ark to the Jews. It's said that after the ark was returned, the plague ceased. The plague has plagued mankind since the dawn of time, and since fleas will probably survive the apocalypse, it's not likely to go away anytime soon. The first recorded outbreak of the plague occurred in Athens during the beginning of the Peloponnesian War during the summer of 430 BC. Roughly 300,000 people died, including the great orator Pericles. The Eudides survived and recorded the symptoms of the disease in both animals and humans. The first pandemic was known as the Justinian pandemic. It began in 541 AD and lasted until 750 AD. It began in Ethiopia, then moved to Egypt, the Middle East, and parts of Mediterranean Europe. It made its way across the trade routes in 8 to 10-year cycles. Over this 200-year period, 50 to 60% of the population perished. Then it stopped. For 600 years, the plague was absent from Europe. The second pandemic began in 1330 and lasted until 1346. Global trade, war, crowding, poor sanitation, and poor nutrition pushed the disease along the new and expanded trade routes from Europe to China and north of the traditional Silk Road. It passed close to Mongolia and northwest China. It was thought that infected marmots were the source of the disease in these areas. During a battle at Kaffa in Crimea, the Mongols catapulted bodies of dying plague victims into the city in order to spread the disease to their enemies. Plague was spread by Genoese ships along trade routes that entered Europe through Messina, Genoa, and Marseille during the year 1347. In October of that year, 12 ships from the Black Sea docked at the port of Messina. The people who had gathered on the docks to await the arrival of the ships were horrified when they found that most of the sailors on the ships were dead. Those who were still alive were covered in black boils that oozed blood and pus. Sicilian authorities ordered the fleet out of the harbor, but it was too late. The next 5 years saw more than 20 million people die in Europe. This was the beginning of the worldwide spread of plague, resulting in the deaths of 30 to 40% of the population. Pope Clement VI asked Guy de Chauliac, dean of the oldest medical university in Montpellier, who was a plague survivor himself, to track the disease for a year. De Chauliac found that both bubonic and respiratory plague had mortality rates of 42%. Giovanni Boccaccio painted his depiction of the plague in Florence, Italy in 1348. He believed that the plague was punishment from God for, quote, our iniquitous way of life, end quote. In his writings, Boccaccio described the plague as, quote, in men and women alike, at the beginning of the malady, certain swellings, either on the groin or under the armpits, waxed to the bigness of a common apple, others to the size of an egg, some more and some less, and these vulgar named plague boils, end quote. The blotches were said to be a sign that the patient was near death. Most died within 3 days of showing symptoms of the disease. While doctors did try to treat patients, their treatments were sorely inadequate. Bloodletting, boil lancing, burning herbs, and bathing patients in rosewater or vinegar were among the treatments that were prescribed. People believed that the disease was spread through contact with infected people or through their clothing. Some believed it was spread by touching anything a sick person owned, whether that sick person had touched it or not. Some believed that the disease would travel from the eyes of a dying person directly into the mouths of healthy people. Bodies began to pile up. There was no one to mourn, no one to cry or light candles, and most importantly, there was no one to bury the dead. Now, I want everyone to imagine something. Imagine that everyone around you is falling ill with a disease that no one understands. It's completely out of control. People seem fine one day, then the next day they have lumps on their bodies. They're feverish, and they're bedridden. A few days later, their skin begins to turn black, and shortly after that, they die. All around you, one by one, neighbors, friends, and relatives are all being taken down by this awful disease that has no cure and no treatment. It's due to this that communities experienced breakdowns. Many people retreated into isolation, not leaving their homes unless they were forced to go out for food or supplies. Doctors refused to see patients. Priests refused to administer last rites. Shopkeepers closed their doors. All of this to avoid the plague. Others left their families. Men left their wives to fend for themselves and their children. Mothers left their children to fend for themselves alone. Many completed suicide. They would rather that they die by their own hand than have the plague take them. Many who believed that the plague was God's punishment started looking for ways to win God's favor. Some believed that in order to become righteous again, they needed to rid their communities of heretics. By this way of thinking, many Jews were murdered in 1348 and 1349. Groups of men called flagellants moved from town to town. They brought whips made of heavy leather straps that were studded with sharp metal. They would beat themselves and one another while townspeople watched. They would repeat this ritual 3 times a day for 33 and a half days before moving on to the next town. This ritual would give the townspeople some odd source of comfort that others were sacrificing themselves to appease God. When events of catastrophic proportions occur, this happens. Fear and desperation take over, and civil life crumbles. Many fled cities and went to the countryside, but they found that there was no escape from the plague. Not only were people falling ill, but also pigs, sheep, goats, cattle, and chickens were dying of the plague. So many sheep had died during this time that the plague had created a shortage of wool in Europe. Following this pandemic, there were outbreaks of the plague worldwide in 2 to 5 year cycles. Quarantine was created when, in 1374, the Black Death reared its ugly head again in Europe. It began in Venice, where the city leaders began instituting public health controls, such as isolating victims from healthy people and preventing ships carrying the disease from landing at port. In 1377, the Republic of Ragusa established a ship's landing station far away from the city, where travelers suspected of carrying the plague were required to spend 30 days to see whether they would become ill. If they remained healthy, they were free to leave. This was called Trentina. This period of time was found to be too short, though, and in 1403, travelers began to be required to spend 40 days in a hospital in isolation. This was called the quarantina, or 40 giorni. The change from 30 days to 40 days may have been founded in history. It could be based on the observance of Lent, the period that Christ fasted in the desert, or it could be based on the Greek doctrine of the critical days, which stated that contagious disease will develop within 40 days after exposure. Quarantine had been established all across Europe during the 14th and 15th centuries. During the 18th century, Habsburg established a cordon sanitaire, which was a line between infected and clean parts of the continent. This line ran from the Danube to the Balkans and was manned by local peasants with checkpoints and quarantine stations set up to prevent infected people from crossing from Eastern Europe to Western Europe. Italy experienced epidemics in 1575, 1630, and 1656. The first PPE was discovered during the 15th century, thanks to the plague. Doctors began wearing protective garb that covered them head to foot. The suits were made out of either leather or oilcloth robes, leggings, gloves, and a hood. They wore wide-brimmed hats that denoted their status as doctors. Under the hats, they wore beak-like masks with glass eyes and 2 nostrils filled with aromatic herbs and flowers to ward off the miasmas. They took their patient's pulse with a stick. They passed prescription through doors of their homes, and buboes were lanced with knives several feet long. Imagine that, seeing an apparition with a knife that's several feet long coming at you while you're dying of some weird illness. From 1665 to 1666, a major outbreak of the plague occurred in Europe and England. The event was documented by Samuel Pepys in 1665 and by Daniel Defoe in 1722 in his book A Journal of a Plague Year. This epidemic peaked in September of 1665 when an estimated 7,000 people per week were dying of the plague. Healthy people quarantined in their homes. They painted crosses on their doors. They went out only for supplies and stayed away from other people. Social distancing is not a new concept. Between 1665 and 1666, 100,000 people died of the plague in London, nearly a fifth of the population. It's very possible that the Great Fire of London in 1666 is what put a stop to it. After the fire, houses made of timber and thatch were replaced with brick homes. This gave rats no place to nest, leading to a severe reduction in the rat population. In 1665, the Derbyshire town of Eyam was going about its business. The villagers were aware of it, but the plague hadn't come that far yet. No one had left the village, but supplies were being delivered from London. Late that summer, a bale of cloth had been delivered to Eyam. The bale had been opened to air out before use by George Vickers, the tailor's assistant. This simple act unleashed the plague on Eyam. While unbaling the cloth, Vickers released hundreds of fleas that were carrying the disease. A week later, on September 5th, 1665, George Vickers died of the plague. His entire family died shortly after. Many more died in Eyam over the fall and winter seasons. By spring, the mortality rate dropped, but the plague wasn't finished. It had gone from bubonic to pneumonic, and more villagers were getting and spreading the disease. Reverend William Mompesson was a new parish rector. He joined forces with Thomas Stanley, who was the previous pastor, to form a plan to fight the disease. They convinced the townspeople to stay in Eyam and suggested that the town should participate in social distancing. There were those who tried to leave, but they soon returned when they were found to be unwelcome in other nearby villages. When people realized that they were from Eyam, they threw stones and mud at them and yelled, "The plague! The plague!" In Eyam, the plan was to hold church in the open air. The townspeople would gather at Cucklet Delph, a natural amphitheater. Families would stand far away from one another to attend worship services. Most heroically, though, Mompesson and Stanley asked that the townspeople remain in quarantine within the village. No one in and no one out. This would keep the disease from spreading to other nearby towns and villages. Eyam laid on an important trade route between Sheffield and Manchester. If the disease spread from Eyam, thousands more could die. The villagers were certain that they would all die if they stayed, but they could cause many thousand to die if they left. So they all chose to stay and prevent any further spread. The Duke of Devonshire owned much of the land around Eyam, and he agreed to supply the village with food and necessities from his Chatsworth estate a few miles away. There would be no person-to-person contact during these transactions. The edge of the village was marked by large boulders called the boundary stones. Food and other supplies would be left at the boundary stones, and in exchange, the townspeople would leave gold coins that they had soaked in vinegar. They believed that vinegar could disinfect the coins. The death toll skyrocketed. Each family was told to bury its own dead to minimize the spread of the contagion. There would be no more burials in St. Lawrence churchyard. The families buried their dead on the edge of town. After the stonemason passed away from the plague, there was no one left to even mark the graves of the dead, and soon there were no more family members to bury them, and the bodies piled up. Elizabeth Hancock buried all 6 of her children and her husband over the course of 8 days in August of 1667. She covered her mouth with a handkerchief to fend off the smell and dragged each one to a field on the edge of town to bury them. The town began to fall apart. There was no one to repair roads, bury the dead, do any repairs on homes or businesses. Crops were left to seed in the fields, and gardens became overgrown. Many families chose to make camps outside of town so they could maximize their distance from others and the dead. Many people donned masks stuffed with herbs to keep the plague away. A few even sat in sewers because they claimed that the smell was so bad the plague couldn't get to you there. Plague victims knew they were coming down with the disease by a sweet, flowery odor they smelled just before becoming symptomatic. William Mompesson's wife, Catherine, smelled a sweet smell on the air the night before she became ill. Mompesson knew then that she had become infected. After 14 months, the quarantine was lifted. The plague had burned itself out. Life returned to normal as it could get after suffering through that devastation. Trade picked up quickly since lead mining was the main source of wealth, and it was too valuable to ignore. Today, Eyam is a commuter town for the towns of Sheffield and Manchester. Farms still surround the area that has been unchanged for centuries. The boundary stones still surround the town, and of course, there are the graves. The graves of those who chose to face certain death so that others wouldn't have to. The third pandemic began in 1894 in the Yunnan region of China and spread globally via shipping from Hong Kong. That same year, Alexandra Yersin, a bacteriologist at the Institut Pasteur, isolated the bacteria and began research on a cure. But the cure wouldn't be found until the 1940s when antibiotics were found to be a treatment. Most recently, an outbreak of pneumonic plague struck Madagascar in 2017. 2,414 cases were reported during the outbreak between August and November of that year. The plague is still a mystery to researchers. While we know quite a bit about its evolution and its virulence, we still have a long way to go with detection. If it cannot be identified within the first 24 to 48 hours, the plague can be, and most oftentimes is, fatal. Okay, so that's the conclusion of Season 4, The Moldy Oldies. Next time, we kick off Season 5 with Restaurant Rogues, the foodborne diseases. Yes, Eric, this is your season. I want to thank my friend Elle Long for suggesting the story of Eyam for this episode. That was a great story to research. I also want to thank Claire Taylor for hanging in there with my Patreon. I hope that you're enjoying the extra content, Claire. And finally, I want to thank everyone who listens to this show. You make it what it is. Please contact me if you have questions or if you just want to say hello. I'm always willing to chat. I can be reached on Facebook, Twitter, and on the website, or you can email me at jackie@causeofdeath100sex.net. Thank you again for listening to Cause of Death, 100 Seconds to Midnight. I'll see you in 2 weeks.